Hey everyone, so quick disclaimer before this episode begins. By and large, this is going to be an uncensored episode, not because we talk about anything salacious or any F bombs dropped or anything like that. But as I had a chance to go back and listen and clean up a few things, I really just left the conversation as it was. And I say that because there's a few things I wish I would have said differently, or there's actually a couple things I wish I just wouldn't have said at all. And unfortunately, that's just how life goes. But I wanted to leave those things in because this was a conversation between friends, and before the conversation and after the conversation ended, I mean that's where we are. So really, just wanted to invite you guys to listen and be a part of this conversation because for me personally, whether it's our episodes on the Godzilla films or this here, we're not trying to present a manifesto. We're really just trying to open up the conversation. We're trying to invite people to the table, to listen, to dialogue, and figure out what we can do to help one another and really just, build up this community. So if you haven't already stopped by this point, thank you. And we'd love to hear your thoughts when you're done. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Building a Bridge, or I guess the Kaiju Apostle podcast, Building a Bridge edition. This is David, and if you listened to us last week, you're probably expecting the episode for War of the Gargantuas. That is coming, but as of today, being June 6th of the year 2020, Chris and I were talking, and we just felt like this was a little bit more important, and by a little more important, quite a bit more important. So if you've been paying attention to anything at all, what's happening in the world is not news to you. We're going to get into details and our thoughts about that a little bit more, but this episode is just really going to be dedicated to diving into the topic of racism, getting into the police systems in our country a bit as well. I understand that's probably, a lot of you guys are listening to Godzilla podcast because you want to get away from that, right? And I completely understand that. Unfortunately, that's not something that we can really afford to do right now. I don't think it's something that we need to just weigh ourselves down with incessantly. There needs to be some balance, but ultimately, this is important. People are hurting. People are crying out for help, and this is our chance to actually figure out how we can help. And as a podcast, we feel very strongly about it, not just because we care about humans, but because as Christians, we feel that if we are going to follow a Jewish man who was crucified for his beliefs, which is not that dissimilar to what happened to black men in the early 1900s, but that's an aside point. It's our job to say something as well. So we hope that as this conversation happens, we're asking you to just try lowering your defenses. Maybe if this isn't something that you feel maybe the same way or as strongly, because the goal of this conversation isn't to condemn anyone. The goal of this conversation isn't to, we really are trying to find a way to build a bridge here. But unfortunately, sometimes that can be painful. It can take time. but we do feel strongly enough about that to do this. Um, but lest you think I'm just some white guy trying to capitalize on what's happening right now, I just wanted to share a very quick story about myself to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. So, I grew up in the Mormon church um, when I was young, and I left the church when I was about 20 years old. The One of the big catalysts, if not the biggest catalyst for that, was recognizing the latent racism within the history of the Mormon church and the beliefs. For me, I just not only seen the way that slaves were treated and black and men and women were treated after, the Civil War, the way that God seemed to conveniently change his mind about certain things in the midst of the civil rights movement. There was a lot of stuff happening there. And for me, I could not reconcile, I could not get myself to commit to a religion if it meant that I had to willingly hold on to these beliefs. Now, I wasn't raised in what most people would view as like a racist household, right? But I look back at what the church, what I heard in these circles, that now I realize were implicit, right? Concerns about mixed marriages. There were again, certain privileges within the church were not allowed until the civil rights movement. There's a list of things here that as a kid, I was never told, you should hate black people, but there was enough going on to help guide my biases and prejudices towards not loving and caring for those who look different than myself. Um, I say all that because this isn't something that is new for me. I have spent the past 10 years trying to repent and move past that and find ways to listen and learn. And again, in this moment of what's going on, Chris and I felt like if we could amplify some voices that need to be heard, maybe there's a chance that others would be willing to listen and start taking these steps as well. But before we do get into this episode, I'm not sure how you're listening to us, how you found us, but on our website at thekaijuapostle.com, if you go down our page and find this episode, there will also be a interview as well with his name is Joe. We weren't able to coordinate an actual recording with him, but he did do an interview with us. Just his experiences as being a black man in the Godzilla fandom. It was a very humbling experience having this correspondence with him. Joe, I really appreciate your time. I definitely recommend you taking the time to read that as well. But that being said, joining me tonight is Faye. So I have had the privilege of knowing Faye for a few months now. We've had some incredible conversations. We've had a few conversations where I've had to realize how maybe insensitive or where I've needed to work on things. And it's very rare in life that you find people as compassionate and patient as she is. So I'm very thankful not only to have her on this episode, but to have her as a friend as well. So Faye, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, actually.
Awesome. So if you wouldn't mind, I know you just did an episode with the Monsters vs. Men guys.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be some cross-pollination there, but would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Faye. I am 21. I am a POC trans girl, so I get into a lot of different segments of this. I've been a Godzilla fan for a long time. My first exposure to Godzilla, though, is kind of funny because it was, I don't know if you remember this, David. Do you remember when Animal Planet did that documentary about Godzilla?
I don't.
Okay, Animal Planet did this documentary about Godzilla for their Animal Icon series, and that was my first thing that made me want to get into Godzilla. So after I saw that, I was like, "Wow, this looks cool." So I asked my dad, who had been trying to get me into Godzilla since I was very small, and I was like, "Hey, can we watch Godzilla?" So we watched Godzilla 2000 that 4th of July, and that's set my path on this ever since. I write for something ghoulish, as you all know. I also am on for our culture, but I haven't submitted any articles yet. That will be changing. And just this night, right before this, actually, David, um, I recorded the first episode of what we're calling the Godzilla Roundtable with me and two other friends, and we're going through the Godzilla movies one at a time, which, like I said, was inspired by you guys at Kaiju Apostle and Monsters vs. Men.
That's awesome. Yeah, I did hear you say something about that on their on the Monsters vs. Men episode.
Yeah, and I'm really excited for it because we did the first episode and we touched on a lot of really great stuff, but you guys will see it when it's done. But that will be up on YouTube at
Okay.
Fears, Futures, and Fossils, and I'll plug that on my own Twitter.
Okay. Awesome. So do you plan on releasing that in a audio only format, or will it just be exclusively YouTube?
It will probably also be audio only because we did it just with audio, but the main hub will be on YouTube.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, definitely excited for that. We will have no problem plugging that once everything gets going there. Um, okay. So before we get into a little bit meatier topics,
Hmm.
and I think I'd maybe mentioned this while we're recording, maybe before, but the last thing we really wanted to do is just, like I said, just kind of cheaply capitalize on this, right?
Hmm.
But at the same time, what I've realized is getting into the fandom, how diverse it actually is. But the problem, and you and I have discussed this, is sometimes we look at the avatars or the
Yeah.
pictures on social media, and we lose sight of the people behind there, but then we also don't always know who we're talking to, right? Because
Hmm.
I don't think it was even until recently that, I knew what your ethnicity was. I don't think I
Hmm.
knew, recently that you were even trans. Like, it doesn't matter
Hmm.
to me. Like, and like, obviously, I'm going to adjust my correspondence with you accordingly, but it's not as if I think of you any less.
Hmm.
And I say that because I wonder how many other fans are out there who don't do that because maybe they are scared of some form of rejection, right? Because they
Yeah.
don't, I mean, this is a fandom about Japanese movies, and it's a fandom that by and large, even though it is diverse, it's dominated by white dudes, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's an irony there.
It
So
is.
I get why maybe not everyone is willing to necessarily say everything about them in a public format, and
Hmm.
we'll get into that later with some of the issues we've been having here recently. So why why do you love Godzilla? But also, like, how has it been for you and your unique experience being in the fandom? Because
Hmm.
obviously, who you are is going to, I mean, you're going to have a much different experience than the majority of us.
Yeah. Well, to start on that first bit of why I love Godzilla, like I said, I started because I love dinosaurs. I think that's why a lot of us started because dinosaurs are cool. Godzilla's a big giant T-Rex with spikes. That's cool.
Hmm.
But really, I feel like what made me love Godzilla, like beyond just like, oh, it's cool, was when I was in middle school. We went down to Toms River, New Jersey, which had this really cool, really big FYE.
Hmm.
And for the first time, I got Gojira on the TCM DVD, the first ever release of it on home video with the black hardcover.
Hmm.
And I got that, and I watched it the next night, and I was blown away at how deep and allegorical that movie was.
Yeah.
And the reason why I bring that up is because my writing is such a big part of me. I love writing. Writing has been my release. It's been how I've survived a lot of stuff in my life. I turn to it a lot for fun, for catharsis, because it's important. And I will honestly say Gojira was really the first thing that really affected my writing and how I used allegory and how powerful allegory can be if you use it right. And I'd say that that's really why I love Godzilla. And then it continues for that, like I talked about Monsters versus Men, how much Godzilla 2014 and King of the Monsters have really helped me as a person. And even when I look back, like on GMK is the one that really comes to my mind, is what really helped shape my politics because I remember, I don't know how, but from a young age, I always knew from GMK that somehow Japan wasn't entirely honest with itself about World War II for a while, which is what
Hmm.
GMK is about.
Yeah.
So it's Godzilla's really shaped me in a lot of ways, I feel like. And in terms of the fandom aspect of it, I think the big thing with the fandom is, at least for me, like you said, David, I can only really speak for myself,
Mhm.
but I feel like you're always guarded in the Godzilla fandom when you're not like a straight cishet white guy.
Yeah.
You're always wondering, okay, is this person actually like okay with it, or do they just hide it a lot? Like, is it right if I mention something without naming names?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like just last night, a big Godzilla fan artist was people saw their likes and saw they're liking stuff that was against
Oh,
everything
yeah,
going
yeah,
on,
yeah. Yeah.
and I would have never expected that from him. And I felt blasted by it because I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And I feel like that's like a recurring thing, not just in the Godzilla fandom, but in fandoms as a whole. You're always like, "Is this person good? Is this person?" I don't want to say bad, but like, are their views harmful?
Mhm.
Are they an ally? Are they going to reject you for what you are? And I feel like that's the constant experience, because oftentimes it's not always overt and on the surface. Sometimes it's very insidious or in very double meanings or in how they
Mhm.
talk about events. And unless you know to look out for it, sometimes you don't really know it.
Yeah.
And like, I've been in the fandom for a long time. I started on Toe Kingdom, the forums, way before I should have been on it.
No one should be on there, to be honest.
Yeah, that just also shaped me. Like for a while, my experiences on the Toa Kingdom forums kept me away from the Godzilla fandom because I really was so. I don't want to say traumatized, because I've been traumatized by actual serious stuff. So I don't want to say it's exactly on that level, but it left me with a scar of now wanting to be invested in the Godzilla fandom. Until ironically, when you reached out to me,
Mhm.
and when Chris from GargantuaCast started reaching out to me, that's really what made me come out of my shell and start talking to other Godzilla fans, not just my own personal circle of friends about it.
Yeah. And what's funny is I remember when we first started talking, it wasn't even like an argument. We were disagreeing on something, but like the conversation ended really well. And
Mhm,
you told me that, well, because of this specific person, you didn't assume you'd be able to have a conversation with me like that. And I was like, well,
mhm,
maybe you should try talking to me and assessing me for who I am.
mhm,
But what's funny is, even with that person, like, I've seen changes. But anyway, besides the point. But
mhm,
yeah, I mean, it is something where, you have to have like legitimate conversations with people and treat them as human beings, and not just like, I don't know, sometimes when we have these conversations, we just treat people like an argument to win, right? We're not
yeah,
actually considering like, what's the ramifications for the words that I'm using? Like, maybe I need to tone this down a little bit
mhm,
because we're just talking about Godzilla. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, so I completely get that. And unfortunately, Toho Kingdom, Reddit, I mean, a
Oh,
lot of
you
this.
mentioned the big bad two of those
Yeah.
of the
Yeah, I
Godzilla
mean,
communities.
oh, yeah, Reddit was really bad. I mean, I actually had a huge blowout with the mods before I left.
Don't even try liking anime Godzilla on the Reddit. You'll
Oh, I
be
know.
swarmed.
Yeah, it was absolutely ridiculous.
And with Toho Kingdom, I feel like a lot of elitism and a lot of bullying is very just part of the community there almost. It's
Mhm.
really sickening to a degree. Because I remember, like, I'll admit, I was on there way too young. Like, I was like 11, 12 when I was
Oh,
on there.
wow.
Should not have been on there. But, you're a dumb kid. And you always think,
Mhm.
oh, yeah, it's fine. It's Godzilla fan. Especially if you grow up and there's really nobody around. You almost get like thirsty to interact with people who know what the hell you're talking about and who
Yeah.
care about it. But like, I was harassed by a group of people on there across multiple sites who would get into my accounts, like get into my Facebook account at the time, other forum accounts, YouTube channel, just a lot of stupid stuff.
Yeah. So I wanna go back to something you
Mhm,
had said. So you had mentioned just kind of being surprised by what you had found with this particular person. Oh, there's smoke detector. So I get that. And honestly, like, I think there's almost a parallel here. And I'm not trying to make this lightly, so
mhm,
please, our listeners don't read into this more than you should. So
Mhm.
there's almost a boldness with Twitter in the way that we see cops who know they're getting filmed and they don't care. We're
Mhm.
seeing people who are liking things on Twitter, and I can guarantee you they don't care. It's almost
Yeah.
like they want people to know, right? Um, which
Well,
is
like,
unfortunate.
mhm.
Oh,
Sorry,
so
sorry to cut you off.
you're good.
But like, I was, want me to go first, or should you go first?
All I was gonna say, so
Mhm.
it's just unfortunate because you're right. I mean, these are people that we think we're close to, or as close as you can be with strangers on Twitter in a Godzilla
Mhm.
fandom. But we develop these relationships with people, and then we find out. I mean, we're not disagreeing about like so within Christian circles, you might disagree. Is it old Earth creationism? Is it new Earth creationism? Just like pretty. I would say it's worth having the conversation, but not worth like cutting ties. We're not talking
Mhm.
about that. We're talking about like, hey, like I don't think your sexual orientation or, your non-heteronormativity should be displayed in media.
Mhm.
Like that's a big deal. I mean, even like you can not, agree with that, but you don't have to go to that extreme, right? You don't have
Mhm.
to say, I dislike you so much, I can't stand the thought of you having any form of representation in media. Like
Mhm.
that right there, yeah, I get why you'd be like, okay, I don't want anything to do with this person
Mhm.
because that is who I am. So, yeah, that's been happening to a lot of people lately. Is especially with what's been happening with the police, is realizing like, I had one friend in particular today. He's been talking about just his experiences as a black man. He's like, honestly, like I never realized how many racist friends I had until the past week, and I'm just like, and I think part of it, and I told him, I was like, I think part of it is they thought you were white enough for them, but now you're asserting your identity as a black man, and
Mhm.
they're like, nope, I can't have it, you know?
And like, I feel like that's been a bit of thing where you just will see people showing themselves for really who they are with this.
Mhm.
Like, because it's I feel like with politics, it's an interesting, and because this isn't, like, I don't know, it's hard to explain it. Like, this is human rights, but sadly, that's considered politics by a lot of people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's a whole other big topic. As long as it's not in your face or on the news, people can cover up and hide it. But when it's something like this, where it's so omnipresent and where it's literally everywhere, people start to show themselves for who they truly are and how they truly feel.
Mhm.
And like we've been seeing, people have been showing themselves, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you see, so you and I were talking about, beforehand, it was a Mark Gugino. I don't know how you pronounce his
Yeah.
last name, the guy who was shoved down the older gentleman. And not only, is he in critical condition, I think he's stabilized, but still, serious condition. But I think there's like, yeah, two police officers were charged with assault, but then like 57 other cops quit in solidarity with them. And I'm like, that's where you draw the line?
I know, right?
Like, really?
You quit because they got in trouble for putting a man in the hospital.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, that blows my mind.
Yeah. But no, you're right. We are starting to see who people really are at this point. Oswald Chambers, he wrote devotional, I think in like the 1800s, but there's a line here, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but it's like crisis doesn't produce character, it reveals it, right?
Mhm.
So in these moments, we're starting to see who people really are. We're starting to see, and I don't think you have to necessarily shout from the mound, the rooftops and the mountaintops 24/7. But
Mhm.
I definitely have seen within our fandom and even within my own Christian community who has said something and who hasn't. And
Mhm.
yes, there is a risk of people saying something and it just being lip service, like all of the corporations. Well, the
Yes.
majority of the corporations. I think some of
Lucasfilm.
them, yeah, yeah. Well, and then someone was criticizing Jordan for donating, $10 million a year for 10 years. And they're like, well, that's
Mhm.
just a tax write off. I'm like, who cares?
No,
They're
it's not.
still doing it.
Yeah, that's still a
Like,
lot of money.
yeah, no, it's an incredible amount of money. So, okay, yeah, just if you want to miss the point, sure, whatever. But yeah, I do think there's, there are some people, it's just lip service. I get that. But like, there is definitely, you can see who cares and who
Who
doesn't.
doesn't?
Or,
Mhm.
and yeah, and I was talking to Anthony from Something Ghoulish about this via private message, where, I do hesitate to lay judgment on anyone who hasn't said
Mhm.
anything, just because I'm like, on the one hand, I'm not going to police someone to say what they should do with social media.
Mhm.
But then I'm kind of like, well, if you're going to post 100 tweets a day about everything in general, but you won't say anything about this, I kind of just wonder, like, why? Maybe
Yeah.
you're still processing, right? Maybe because here's the thing, and I'm not trying to make this about me. I really not. But something I've realized is like for a lot of people, this is the first time they've really had to wrestle with the fact that there is an issue in our
Mhm.
law enforcement system. There's been issues for years and years and years. We were talking about
Mhm.
before we started recording the West Memphis 3, right?
Mhm.
So what blows my mind about that case is not only was it, three white boys who were accused of rape and murder and not even close to being, guilty at all, but one of the quote unquote eyewitnesses, in 2003, she talks about how like the police forced her to give a false witness. She said that
Mhm.
the police had told her, well, I guess implied, but if she did not cooperate with them, they would take away her kid. Like, I'm not saying it's right, but it's like, holy crap.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't? I mean, he's three kids and your child. Of course you're going to take care of your child. You're scared of the cops. You know what the cops can do. So I think there are a lot of people who are still processing right now. Maybe they don't know what to say, which is again why I wanted to do this episode, because it isn't just, a
Mhm.
cab, all cops are bastards. It isn't just like you don't have to go to these absolute extremes to say that like, hey, there's
Mhm.
an issue here. We need to do something. This has been going on way too long. Let's figure out what we need to do.
Mhm.
So, um, but for you specifically, I mean, I think I've heard you talk more about like sexism in the fandom, which is
Yeah.
absolutely a real thing. But I mean, have you experienced? I mean, because I don't, maybe because you haven't, you have your avatar, right? So
Yeah.
maybe people don't see that, but like, have you still? Maybe it's like blowback would be the right word, or you
Yeah.
kind of feel the effects. Like, what has been your experience in this fandom or other fandoms with that?
I feel like with racism, I think because it's so socially unacceptable to be openly racist, even among people who are on the right or conservative or right leaning, they'll try to cover it. I feel like I said, it's very covert, but then there's times where you can tell. In the Godzilla fandom, up until recently, which is not a good thing, I wish we didn't have to. I honestly hadn't seen a lot of it. Like you
Hmm.
said, I saw more sexism. But I do think, though, before I get into my experience with other fandoms, I want to say with the Godzilla fandom, I think sometimes it's almost like race blindness,
Hmm.
and that's not always a good thing. Like, to bring up King of the Monsters, I think a big reason why King of the Monsters left some impact with some POC fans like myself is King of the Monsters has so many characters of color in it, like a
Yeah.
lot of characters of color, and pretty decently sized roles too. Like they're not just minor lip service characters like in Godzilla versus Biollante, where they have the black guy show up. So, oh look, guys, it's America. He's
Oh
black,
God.
which is a
Yeah.
bad stereotype in Japan. Like, not, it's not even limited just to Biollante. I've seen an anime as well. Like Gate uses that same trope, but that's a whole
Hmm.
different topic. But in Kingdom Monsters, you have characters like Oshia Jackson Jr.'s character, who's really fun. He's really funny. He's one of the big characters. You have the main general of that movie being a black woman, and she's powerful,
Yeah.
and she's not talked down to or anything. She's a voice of reason. You have characters like the squad mates being men and women of color as well. So you have a lot of those
Hmm.
elements too. And I feel like the fandom just doesn't really talk about that.
Yeah.
But in terms of other stuff, though, unfortunately, I feel like you'll see it more in likes. Like I don't want to name names, but like we had one person whose likes and retweets were just abominable.
Mhm.
What they were saying about Muslims and people of color, and et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like almost in this fandom, this isn't limited to just racism, but I feel like if you have the right opinions, people are not going to call you out for it as much as they would someone who
Yeah.
has the quote unquote wrong opinions. Like I remember feeling so blown by it because with King of the Monsters fans, which is fair, 'cause I've seen a few, um, a fair few of them
Mhm.
also have those racist tendencies or sexist tendencies. I used to be like, oh look, the King of the Monsters fans tend to be like this. But then for somebody who's like, yeah, the show movies are the best. If you don't know 50 Japanese actors' names, you're not a real Godzilla fan, et cetera.
Yeah.
Everyone was just silent. And I get missing stuff, trust me, because I did not know about this the fan artist who I mentioned earlier, his likes at all. But he never retweeted stuff.
Yeah.
When you retweet stuff, it's a bit harder to miss all of it. I can believe if you're very busy. But on the other hand, I have to wonder how much of it also, oh, they have the opinions I share, so I don't want to get rid of them. And I can relate to that too, because there was a Kingdom Hearts fan who I followed who I had to mute because they were retweeting stuff which I was just did not agree with. That was very vile. And it took me a while to get, no, Faye, you have to follow them. You can't support this even implicitly.
Yeah.
And I think that's an issue a lot of fandoms have in general, not just about racism, but with bad stuff like abusers or abuse apology or sexism or homophobia or transphobia, where if the right person with the right opinions has those views, they won't be challenged as much as if it's somebody with the wrong opinions or the wrong views, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It's tough because I mean, obviously, I know the instance you're talking about because we had a conversation about it, and that
Mm,
was kind of where I was at. Where I'm like, well, I'm at that point. I'm still dealing with Harlow recovery, and I'm not on
yeah,
Twitter that often. I miss this, and then I start digging in a little bit, and unfortunately, I do see what you're talking about, and and I think what's interesting is this isn't exclusive to fandoms. This is just how people are, right? Where
exactly.
we within church circles, we will pick out certain things that we want someone to believe in, and as long as they believe that, we're willing to look over other things,
Hmm.
right? And I know I will catch flack for this, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Unfortunately, we see that issue when Trump came into office, where
Hmm.
evangelicals were very supportive for him because he did XYZ, even though someone else brought up to me the other evening he ran on a pro same sex marriage platform. I don't know how evangelicals managed to look over that, but
I know, right?
that's besides the point. So, but he hit what they were looking for and they were willing to look over everything else, right?
Hmm.
And so we do that. We do that with a lot of different things. But to your
Well,
point,
mhm.
go ahead.
Not to cut you off, but because like this is like, can I talk about like a personal story?
You are more than welcome to say as little or much as
Like,
you'd like.
I know I've talked about this so much. I know some people who probably listen to the Monsters versus Men podcast are like, "Holy smokes, she's going off about this again." But when I came out that I was abused to that friend circle
Mhm.
where me and my ex girlfriend were in, I was so surprised by the lack of support I got and how much people were willing to be like, "Oh, but she's sorry. She's apologized." And would get mad at me for being like, "No, that's not enough." But I feel like if she was someone who wasn't so close to people and who wasn't, what's the word? I guess the only way I could say it, having the right opinions and the right way of putting it, would she have gotten so much support? And like, okay, it's okay, you're sorry, etc.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I could say that. And like, I think we all challenge once people we're friendly with comes out and it's like, wow, this person actually is a POS. And it's like, Like, I get it. I truly do. Because that happened to me not too long after, where somebody who I was very friendly with was abusing their girlfriend emotionally and mentally. And I had to go to myself, no, I can't keep talking to this person. And it's hard, I get it. But on the other hand, how is somebody going to change if you keep allowing them to do what they're doing and they don't get any pushback against it?
Yeah.
If it's just a slap on the wrist, why would somebody stop? What would make them go, wow, I did a really bad thing? Like, it's hard unless there's consequences. Like, I get cancel culture, and you can't just be like, oh, someone said something bad 10 years ago, cancel them. But if someone has repeat behavior or does stuff that's harmful over and over again, you have to start to wonder when you're just abiding by it and abetting by it. And this isn't just in fandoms, like you said. This is in friends groups, like in my
Mhm.
story, or like you said, in church groups. And it's just it's a people issue in general. It's an issue with humanity, and it's just a really severe one. And I think that's part of what you're seeing. Not to make light of it, but with cops, like that circle of brotherhood, like, oh,
Mhm.
we know him though, and it's like, but dude, he freaking killed someone. That's not just a minor thing.
Yeah.
Like how the MPD came out and said, oh, two of the people that were rookies, one that was on his fourth day. I don't care. I don't care if it was there 1 day, 100 days, or 500 days. Somebody lost their life. That can get brought back.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think the biggest way to describe it is groupthink. And I think groupthink is one of the biggest issues humanity will has faced and will continue to face.
Yeah. It's there's a danger in, like, you can definitely go to an extreme of just like inhaling every possible perspective, because there's obviously some perspectives where it's like, no, this isn't worth any time at all. But yeah, if you don't have people keeping you accountable, if you're not actually challenging your presuppositions in life, then yeah, you fall into that group think. It's an echo chamber, right?
Mhm.
And it can be very detrimental because yeah, I think there's an accountability that's missing with, so in fandoms, there's an accountability that's missing because, so I did a video on our Instagram page the other day about this. So talking about racism in the fandom, I don't think, people have brought up there's homophobia in the fandom, there's racism, there's sexism. Like, these things are present, but it's not like you log in and all of a sudden it's just like boom, 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 boom,
There,
boom, boom,
yeah.
right? It's definitely not like that. But the problem is, in my opinion, as a white straight man, is it's again a lack of accountability. It's a lack of keeping people responsible for what they're saying. To me, I think that's the problem, is that, unfortunately, you can't gatekeep someone from liking Godzilla just
Yeah.
because they're racist or they're ignorant or all these things. Unfortunately, like, it's not a requirement. Like, it's not like, that's just, people are going to like what they like. Now, there needs to be some kind of guideline, I think, if we're going to have a community, though. The problem is we don't have a president of the Godzilla fandom, right? We don't
Mhm.
have an elder board. We don't have any kind of governmental structure
Mhm.
because the fandom's very permeable. You can come, you can go as you please. You can be a part of the Godzilla
Yeah.
fandom and the My Little Pony fandom and all these different things, right? Like, there's no requirements except you like
Like
Godzilla.
it.
I
Yeah.
mean, heck, you could have seen 3 Godzilla movies, but have figures of all of the monsters, and you are still legitimately welcome in the Godzilla fandom, no matter what
Mhm.
people tell you. Now, if it's been 5 years and you still have only seen 3 movies, I'm gonna be like, "What are you doing?" Now, that's another conversation. But my issue is, we had someone in our community, and I asked if I could use his name, and he said that I was allowed to. So his name's Nathan, and he was targeted by someone in the fandom who is known for being verbally abusive publicly, but normally in those instances, even though it's still offensive, he would use like the words like autistic or mongoloid or things like that, which are still absolutely atrocious. But like, not
Mhm.
the N word, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, over some of the most senseless and stupid disagreements, this guy just drops N word, N word, N word, N word, N word. And Nathan goes public about it because,
Mhm.
he's a very calm headed guy. And he's like, hey, this is what's happening. And, we try to signal boost it as much as we can because we feel like, okay, this isn't just like disagreeing and having a little spat. Like, this is
Mhm.
one of the most
Disgusting things. Also.
disgusting words in the world. And for all of our white listeners who are saying, but why can the black community say it? Google it. Google is your friend. Anyway, so the point being, no one was keeping this guy accountable. There was
Nobody.
multiple people who said, well, he's my best friend, so I know he didn't mean it. So I was like, okay, so why did he say it multiple times? Well, he's got a lot going on, if you'd understand. Hey, I get it. We all have a lot going on. That doesn't justify it. Those excuses being made, and they're like, I had shared multiple stories about all of this. And I mean, there was hundreds of people who viewed these stories. We had close to 50 mutuals. I think we're down to like 40 now. So that's a change. But my point being is, like, for the first few days, like, nothing was happening at all. And I'm sitting here and I'm literally just venting to people and being like, why do you not care about this? Like, why does, like, in the midst of everything going on right now, why are you not holding this person you consider your friend accountable for their
Mhm.
racist actions? And I maybe there's a fear to it, right? Like, we're not saying like cancel this guy. I'm like, just say something, just do something, because this guy's been verbally abusive to me for a year. Now, I'm 31. I'm not going to let I don't know how old he is. So I keep saying he's a kid because I hope not that he's going to listen to this, but like, so whoever this is, I'm not going to let that ruin my day. But like, that's who this person is, where I've seen him pick on other people. I will step in and be like, hey, that's not appropriate. And he'll turn on me. Right. So, like,
Mhm.
but what I didn't understand is, like, people are defending him. And I think it goes back to what you're saying is, well, he has the right opinions about movies. And I'm like, there's plenty of non-racist people who have good movie opinions. Be friends with them. Like, it's not that hard.
And
And
not to cut you out too much, David, but
you're
something
good.
which I've kind of also done is, if you consider movie opinions more important than like actual serious stuff opinions, I'm gonna side eye you just a little bit, because like, look at me and you. We don't agree on King of Monsters entirely, but I'd still consider you a great friend, and that's because to me, yeah, on what accounts, you have the right views and the right morality and the right opinions on important stuff. That to me will always supersede anything that's not important.
Mhm.
Like, if you hate King of Monsters but you're a good person, I will gladly be friends with you. I have mutuals who cannot stand that movie, but I still consider them great people and great friends, and I'm glad to be in their circles.
Yeah.
But if you like Kingdom Monsters, just to keep going on the example, and you're garbage and you're racist and you're sexist and you're homophobic and you're transphobic, I don't care if you like my favorite one of my favorite movies ever, because you're a garbage person.
Yeah. But see, and what I'll push back on that though
Mhm.
is, first, I get where you're coming from, obviously, because this is a lot more personal for you.
Mhm.
Um, I'm always and maybe this is a good conversation to have getting into actual racism itself, because I
Mhm.
wanted to actually discuss racism in a systemic sense.
Mhm.
So one of my hesitancies in like referring to people as garbage is because I have seen the way that, so like, no one is born and immediately is like, I'm gonna start quoting Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, James
Mhm.
Cone, Cornell West, right? And just have this
Mhm.
like completely robust view of what the black experience in America looks like. And that's not even comprehensive. Those are just
Mhm.
four guys off the top of my head. So like, people grow and they adapt and they change. And like, I've witnessed legitimate, like, these people would be considered garbage racist people, like, not just this weird, like, that video going on the other day of people like, I surrender my white supremacy. I'm like, that's not how this works. So like, I get it's a symbolic gesture, but come on.
Yeah.
Um
It's
and just
very performative.
Yeah, makes me think of the Simpsons gif of Bart with the cake. It's like, at least you tried, and he puts it in the trash.
Yeah.
Um, so like, but I have seen people change, and I'm not just talking a superficial change. I'm like
Hmm.
straight up like, this is a what the in the Christian belief, the idea of repentance is not just saying sorry. It's
Yeah.
a mind change. It's you are literally turning your life around, and I have to believe that people are capable of doing that. So
Like, mhm.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I just
Yeah.
for me personally and for our listeners, like, I challenge people who use that word to consider that, like, okay, so, you know, is this who they are now, but is this who they'll necessarily be forever? But
Hmm.
that's kind of a aside. My real point is, I have friends in my life that I actually fundamentally disagree with things on.
Hmm.
But I think the difference is if you can have two people that disagree on an idea, but there is just an intrinsic, I have intrinsic belief that humans deserve dignity and respect, even if you have some pretty strong political, theological, ethical disagreements, it's still possible to not treat each other like garbage. And that's what
Hmm.
I don't understand is like
Well,
I'm not saying I justify racism, but like at what point do you think like I'm not saying it's okay to not like a black person, but like you don't have to use the N-word. Like you could
mhm.
be like at what point do you get to
Well,
that where it's acceptable?
I feel like though, like, trust me, I get what you mean, and I'm not saying people can't recover
Yeah.
and get better, but on the other hand, it's not the duty of of the group that's being oppressed to educate the oppressor.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people who are white, because we're talking about racism, and who aren't for racism and who are anti-racism, need to talk to to people who are racist and try to educate them.
Mhm.
But I don't think a black person or a Latinx person or an Arab should have to tell why they deserve human rights
Yeah.
and why they deserve respect. So, because it's like I do agree with you. I've seen people change. I've seen people grow. I agree with that entirely. I think we all can relate to growing and changing ourselves. But on the other hand, it's just hard when you're in those groups and you know the person doesn't respect who you are intrinsically,
Mhm.
which you can change. Nobody chooses their gender, their sexual orientation, despite what people will say. Trust me, no one would choose to be this, but how hard it can be. Your race, a disability, like that stuff is just, you don't choose that. You're born with that. And so, like, because I do agree, like I said, people can change, but I don't think it's the duty of the oppressed to educate the oppressor about it. I think that's like you
No,
said,
no, no, no. I, I
yeah.
I agree with that. And there's actually I was listening to a sermon tonight by a guy named Greg Boyd. He did it on June 1st. It's called Please I Can't Breathe. So obviously we know what that's talking about.
Mhm,
But one of the guests on there, her name is Oshida Moore. She's an author, and she was up there talking, and she was like, if you can Google, I don't remember exactly what it was, if you can Google, your next lake home or whatever, you can Google how to be an ally or how to learn
mhm,
how to do this, right? Like
yeah,
Google is your friend. But I will say, because I had even just messaged a friend about this tonight, where I was like, hey, I know it's not your responsibility to teach me about all of this, but I'm thankful that years ago you did take the time to teach me before all of this went down, right?
mhm,
Because she did, but I had to learn how to listen, right? I had
mhm,
to learn how to take the time and actually listen to what people are saying.
mhm,
I think, it's just obviously as a Christian, my pushback is I completely understand where you and others are coming from of just this anger and hurt, which are absolutely all valid feelings. I kind of, in my head, it's kind of thinking out loud, but I wonder when we label people as garbage and, all
mhm,
toxic and all this stuff, not that it's not entirely accurate, at least in the toxic element, but when we label
mhm,
someone as garbage, we're almost saying like we're putting their their value as trash, right? And we don't see
Mhm.
that, we don't know what this person's life is going to be. And so I'm
Mhm.
always personally hesitant to do things like that just cuz I look at who I am as a person. And there's maybe not necessarily in the topic of racism, but just even just like just human decency. I mean,
Mhm.
for lack of better terms, when I was a teenager, I mean, I was a chode, right? Like I was
Mhm.
not like I'm so glad I'm married to my wife, but if she would have met me when I was 18, 19 years old, there is no way she would have dated me then.
Mhm.
Like I know that as a fact, but I learned, I grew, I matured, and I changed. So again, that's just
Mhm.
as that I felt like,
Yeah.
I just have known enough people that have made those changes where, I want to see, like, on the one hand, I want people to share how they're hurting and their feelings and how they've been hurt because those
Mhm.
voices deserve to be heard. But how can we channel that pain and these
Mhm.
experiences to help? It's not your job. You're right. This is
Yeah.
not your job. But how can I take that to have people listen that maybe wouldn't listen
Mhm.
before, and maybe they're hearing this in a new way and like, okay, this makes sense. I'm able to connect the dots
Mhm.
because with racism, and this is where I kind of want to, end the conversation here in a sense. So you and I would both agree racism is systemic, right?
Yeah.
It's built on systems.
Yeah.
But going back to that podcast, that sermon I said I was listening to, what I'm realizing is white people as a whole don't think that way. They think more
Yeah.
individualistically. So this is not a unique idea for me. I'm admitting I'm taking this from somewhere else. But you think about that because what is one of the first things that people will say when we bring up that racism is a problem in America? Faye, like what is probably the one thing that you hear more than anything?
I have to be honest, besides the issue with policing, it would have to be economics.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So I should clarify. So whenever you
Mhm.
say racism is a problem and a white person tries to tell you it's not, what
Mhm.
is their reason for why they say
Oh,
it's
okay.
not a problem? That was my fault for not clarifying.
Okay. Well, I feel like usually people say because, well, look at, like, let's just say, like, just like any big actor or sports player, like, oh, they have millions of dollars, they got ahead.
Hmm.
America's not racist, we fixed it. And
Yeah.
it's like, but that's just an solitary example. That's not the entire group. And no, never will you ever have like an entire group be all right. But
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
look at the numbers and the statistics and you see which groups have it more, and then you combine it with other stuff like crime, people will always be like, oh, crime rates aren't valid because just commit less crimes, but it's not that. It's the sentencing. It's how harshly people are sentenced. Like someone can go away for 10 years for weed, but then you have people who've assaulted people sexually, like Brock Turner. He went away for a few months, and that's a big discrepancy there.
Yeah.
So it's just, and it's very hard, I feel like, to explain it unless you've lived it too,
Hmm.
because, like, do you know of the scientific concept of the monkey spear?
I've heard it, but no, I'm not familiar.
The monkey spear is scientifically and psychologically how we can only comprehend so much within our tribe from our holdovers from, I'm not sure your view on it, David, in terms of evolution. I personally believe in evolution. And scientifically, it's thought to be from our days as apes, how we can only comprehend so much, where even though our brains have gotten bigger and our world has gone much, much, much bigger, we can still only comprehend so much that we've experienced, and that's within our circle. That to a degree, outside concepts and people who aren't in our sphere aren't even in our thoughts. And I think that plays a big role in stuff like racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, because if you don't know anyone like that, and if you've never been exposed to it yourself or from a friend, you wouldn't really think about it. So when you first hear of it, you're like, what the heck are you talking about? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So I was gonna say there's not really right or wrong answer to my question, but that it was really good. Just not the not the way I saw that going.
Sorry.
No, 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 you're good. That's why I didn't stop you.
Mhm.
Um, I was just the reason I had asked that because the thing I hear more often than not is, well, I didn't own slaves. I didn't
Oh, I've heard
lynch
that too. Well, I
anyone.
haven't heard it, but I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've heard it so many times. So, especially in the church. So that the reason I say that is because people will try to pass that off and be like, "Well, I didn't own slaves. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. Why is this my problem?" The problem is because it's a system, right?
Mhm.
So in that sermon, I love how Greg talks about how the world is made up of systems, but we don't notice there's really a system until something goes wrong, right? So we have a highway
Yeah.
system. We're driving. We don't even really think about the highway being a system, but we sure as heck notice it when there's construction, when there's an
Yep.
issue, right? So this is what we're seeing now is there is an issue with this system, with the system setting up for the police, with the criminal justice, all these different things. But with racism itself, it's very systemic because it's not something that just one person does here and then one person does there. It's ingrained into the psyche, the really the spirit of our country because while we have people complaining about Robert E. Lee's statue being taken
Mhm.
down because we're going to forget history, we also struggled to have accurate history in our schools talking about, well, what actually happened to the indigenous people
Mhm.
when colonialists came over, right? And this
Yeah.
was all done in the name of God. It was all name in the done of it was all done in the name of white supremacy, right? There was, the thing there is when people came over to colonize, it was just an assumption that white people are better. It's been that
Exactly.
way for hundreds of years. And so when we look
Mhm.
at that, we look at the treatment of even within the treatment of Jews during World War II. People within our own country.
Mhm.
We see the way that Asian people were treated during World War II because we had our own little freaking internment camps here in the United States, and people
I know,
don't seem to
right?
care about that. Um, and obviously with lynching, like to me, the irony of missing the correlation between lynching a black man and the crucifixion of a Jewish man in the first century, the fact that it has never really dawned on the church, that correlation blows my mind because I didn't even think about that right
Mhm.
until it was The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, and
Yeah.
I've read that and it just blew my mind. So like, there's people
Mhm.
alive right now
Yeah.
who participated in lynchings,
Yes.
who had help, that the help, right? They had
Mhm.
color. Like there's people still alive who voted for those things who are still voting on policies now. So to
Exactly.
say that racism, it's not an individual thing. It's something that is ingrained in the history of our society.
It is.
And I keep citing this sermon because I'm just thinking about how like he's a white pastor in the midst of Minneapolis, trying to make a difference when they really need it. And his point being is this system has worked for white people for so long, but as one of the guests up there had spoken, he was like, but if black people could have changed the system, they already would have, right?
Yes.
And so it's our responsibility as, myself, Chris, other people in the fandom, or just in general, anyone who's listening to this, it's our responsibility as white people to actually make that difference. Because if we're not going to do it, A, it's either not going to happen, or B, it's going to be taken by force, right? We get
Yeah.
upset by all of the violence, that's happening in these protests, which if you actually talk to people at the protests, very small amount of them are supportive of that, right? But
Mhm.
if you're not willing to actually look at the issues that have
Mhm.
resulted in this, you're missing the point. You're It's the
Exactly.
same reason why when George Floyd was killed, immediately people are like, "Well, what's his rap sheet?" And I'm like, "You're missing
Who
the
cares?
point." Yeah,
Exactly.
I mean, you're missing the point. It's not about if you spend so much time trying to
To excuse it and find a way
mhm,
to make it okay, he's still dead.
it's a
It
human
doesn't
life.
matter what it was. That was you can't bring it back. And that's where like I'm not I I'm the sh And never mind, never mind. But what I will say though is on violence, I'm not for it. But at the same point, you can be not for something and still understand the emotion behind it.
Absolutely.
Like I look at Nelson Mandela and how much he's been whitewashed. Nelson
Hmm.
Mandela used to organize bombings of South Africa. That's what he was in jail for. He went because he had to fight against a system so critical against his very existence in his very own homeland. The only way he could fight that was with violence. And people died from it. And I'm not going to say if that's right or wrong, because to a degree, I'm not sure if even I know the answer. But I can get the emotion and what led up to him having to do that,
Hmm.
and how much that must have been weighed on him. But then you hear about stuff like with Trevor Noah, he was born illegal because he was half white and half black, and he was legally not allowed to exist in South Africa.
Yeah.
So when you have a system that's that corrupt and that evil, what's right and wrong sometimes gets very hard. And you even look at our own country's foundation. The American Revolution was far from nonviolent. Tax
Mm,
collectors were murdered
yeah.
just for
Yeah.
trying to collect taxes,
I
tarred and
know.
feathered, a horrific way to die. But we don't talk about that.
No.
And it's like,
Because it was justified,
yeah,
right? Because our rights were taken away, or rather, we deserved rights. We deserve to be able to have our own, all of these things that we say that really, if we think about, are being said right now.
hmm and
But
it's like, is there an easy answer? Generally, no.
no.
Do I have the answer? No. Do you have the answer? I'm pretty sure you would say no as well. But you can,
Yeah, no, no.
but you can get the emotion behind something, if not always the action. And I think that's how I feel with the looting and the rioting. You can get why someone's enraged, if not always approve of the action, or if you would do it yourself. And I think that's an issue in general, not just here, but you look in the Middle East sometimes. And it's like, no, is killing people okay? No, human life has value.
Hmm.
The one moral thing I always stick to just for myself is I hate hurting people, be it mentally, emotionally, physically. It disgusts me. It detests me. That's why even getting into arguments, I try to diffuse them. I try to make them into more debates and discussions, because I don't like making people feel angry or hurt or sad for my own opinions, even when it's stuff that physically bothers me. Like if it's
Hmm.
about like the race, like the isms or the phobias, or even just my own experiences as a survivor of really heinous stuff. I still would rather someone come away from it with knowledge, not with a hurt and pain. But on the other point, do I have, because I'm privileged to a degree. I'm not living in a war zone or under a dictatorship or under a system where I don't exist. And I feel like sometimes in our privilege, we get so caught up in, oh, I would never do it,
Hmm.
or I could never see why, that we can't see sometimes from the other point of view what it'll be like growing up knowing that you could be shot at any second because someone decides, no, your life has no meaning. Like in the Middle East, where
Yeah.
someone could burst into your house at any moment and try to kill you for having a gun, because this is something that happened to my grandparents, where they were broken into by an army. I will not drop because that's a whole bigger topic. And they were nearly shot, and they were only saved because they were Christian. And the fact that if they were Muslim, they would have absolutely been shot. And if they didn't have a crucifix on the wall, and if my grandmother's father could not speak English, that I wouldn't exist. That's haunted me for a while.
Yeah.
Just that thought. And when I think about people, and I'm getting emotional talking about it, because it is a very big thing. And I think about the fact that I have family who still live there and still have to think, like the autistic boy who got shot and killed because he couldn't say, I'm not armed, don't kill me, just
Mhm.
because I'm Arabic. That really bothers me when I think about that, and how I could potentially not exist and experience all that I have if way back my family didn't convert to Christianity, and if they were Muslim, what would have happened to them in that situation? And that's why, even if I don't always approve of the violence or the looting, I can understand that rage, that feeling of wanting to be just respected and being equal. And just when I remember what my grandparents had to go through coming to this country, and the fact that my grandfather had to work 3 jobs, I can get it. Even if I wouldn't personally do it, I can empathize, and I can say, yes, I feel you. I understand your hurt. I may not personally do it, but I feel you. And it's like, and I'm sorry for getting so emotional, but it's something that is very powerful to me, and I'm shaking right now because this is all stuff I felt for so long. So it's why sometimes when people are like, "Oh, but I would never do it," think about where you're sitting, what you have. People don't always have that option. Sometimes it's either that or remaining underfoot, not knowing if you'll make it to the next day. And that's just something I think we need sometimes to get some perspective on.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's tough when you said earlier, I know the typical thing to say there is, "I don't know what to say," because obviously we all know I don't know what to say there. Um, what we were saying earlier about groupthink and echo chambers and limited communities, if you're not actually it's not even just exposing yourself, that's not enough. If you're not listening to people, then of course you're not gonna understand, right? You're not gonna get it.
Hmm.
Um, I know for me personally, as a committed pacifist, because of my religious beliefs, um, I know, like, are you familiar with who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is?
I am not, unfortunately.
Okay, no, you're good. You're good. So
Hmm.
he was a German pastor theologian, who got on the radar of Hitler in the Third
Hmm.
Reich. He came to America. He actually, in his own writing, own words, said he found Jesus in the midst of the black church, which I continually just relish the thought of that for how many conservative Christians love him.
Hmm.
But he eventually was arrested by Nazi soldiers and put to death. Only I think a couple days before that camp was liberated. But I say that because he was very committed pacifist, very committed in trying to follow the ways of Jesus. And then there's kind of conflicting reports on it, but it is believed that, like, are you familiar with the movie Project Valkyrie or whatever,
Yes, I
Valkyrie
am.
or whatever?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So apparently he was actually involved in that, in the plot to kill Hitler. And a lot of people have struggled with that because they're like, well, Bonhoeffer was a pacifist. He believed in nonviolence. He would never do that. And over the past week and a half, 2 weeks, I've been thinking about that. I'm like, no, actually, I believe that he could do it because he held these beliefs for so long. And eventually he just looked at the pain and the suffering and the anger and was just like, I can't do it anymore. Like,
Hmm.
so I say that because on the one hand, I have my beliefs of nonviolence and pacifism, but on the other hand, I absolutely understand why people are upset, why people are angry, why people are lashing out. You can only fill up a cup so far before it starts overflowing, right? What
Hmm.
you could do is address that first before it gets to that point. But unfortunately, we haven't done that. Unfortunately, we have said stupid things like, well, I didn't own slaves. Why is racism? That's not my responsibility. Or, it's just one bad apple. The whole system isn't broken. But again, that gets back to this individualistic view of life.
Hmm.
Whereas I truly believe in this point in time, it's not a bad apple. The entire orchard has an issue. I think we need to look at the soil these trees
Mhm.
are in and realizing, like, because I truly believe, whether you're a Christian or not, you can agree with this, a good tree does not bear bad fruit. So if we
Mhm.
see bad fruit being born and born and born again, we have to look at why. And it's, again, it's not just the police issues, right? Because there are white people who have been oppressed and killed by the police. Obviously, I think the disparity is there for sure,
Mhm.
but there's overreach there, right? It's more than just that. But I think, as and I'm gonna kind of tone this back into the fandom idea.
Mhm.
This is where that accountability comes in, right?
Yeah.
So in the cop sense, you see your friends, your buddies doing stuff like this, call them out. Don't support it. And if you can't, leave. And there have been cops who have quit over this,
Mhm.
right? It's not publicized very widely, but I've seen several instances of that, right? And there unfortunately have been cops who have been killed in the midst of this too. And it's unfortunate that the it's not just about them. I'm thinking of their families right
Mhm.
now. All of a sudden, just in the way that George Floyd's family is mourning him, now we have all these other people who are mourning. And really, I'm just like, why is any life being lost at this point?
Mhm.
But my point there is just, for looking at the fandom, or our own communities, church, work, wherever, we have to hold people accountable. It doesn't mean we have to put them on blast. It doesn't mean we have to, screenshot and crucify them online. But it
Mhm.
means if we say we're friends with someone and they're posting very hateful and very, very ignorant things, or we overhear our friends saying stuff, like, just say something. Like, if you really care about this person, do something. And if you don't care about him and you see it, well, I don't really know what to tell you at that point,
Yeah.
right? But we have to be holding people accountable, because if we're not doing that, then these people feel like they can do whatever they want, right? Because what are the consequences if
Mhm.
nothing is done? I think back to 2018. I was working for a company called Home Advisor, and there was a guy that was harassed by a local contractor. I guess it was a black man. He
Mhm.
had cut him off in traffic accidentally, and the guy comes to his house and is yelling at him in his face, calling him the N word, this and that, MF, all this. But of course, his business name is on the truck. So
Mhm.
dude goes viral. He gets flooded with bad reviews. We take him down off of our listing. I don't even think he has a company anymore, right? Like,
Mhm.
do I do I always agree with those extremes? Not necessarily. I think sometimes, we can try to be vigilantes, and I've seen the wrong people receive the end of quote unquote justice, right? But in
Mhm.
this instance, yeah, people held him accountable, and that's what we needed to do. So I'm not always advocating for that, but like, we need to be doing things. If we see people saying racist stuff, like, say something. There's a guy on Twitter the other day who was saying that he literally is calling protesters animals, and he said if these animals can't be controlled, they need to be put down.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I called him out on it and I reported it to Twitter too. Of course, they haven't done anything because Twitter sucks. But, I'm just like, say something. It's
Mhm.
just say something. I don't know.
I feel you.
So so how do we build the bridge, Faye? Like,
I feel
how
like mhm.
I don't know. Like,
I think listening, and I think people who aren't of color, at least in terms of racism, need to talk about it a bit more and not always brush it under the rug. And I think if we need to be willing to listen more, like just this past week, I know anyone who's followed me has seen it. I got into a really big discussion with a very big Star Wars account about how they talked about black fans
mhm,
and their feelings on Finn in the sequel trilogy. And even though we didn't agree, there was still a discussion there. And I think that's what's important in all of this. Ideally, you would listen and change a bit, but sometimes people aren't always going to listen. But at
mhm.
least if there's a discussion, that's a step in the right direction, I feel like.
Yeah. So but let's take again. I'll go back to what you said. I don't think
Mhm,
it's necessarily, you know, a a man- I really, me personally, and I know this is going to sound bad. I'm not trying to be like a white savior here. When I use the phrase minorities, sometimes that bothers me because it
mhm,
almost implies like I get what it means, but sometimes I struggle with that. So
yeah,
when it comes to what would normally be deemed as minority, but black, brown, Asian, whatever, non-white people, I know it's not your responsibility to teach people. I
mhm,
understand that. So for those who do, it's incredible and very indebted to that. So I guess for those of us who do see an issue with racism, who do believe that our current police system, whether it's reallocating funds or a complete reformation, we see that there's issues. We need more accountability, right? I mean,
mhm.
heck, mandated body cams would go a long way.
I
So
know,
for those
right?
of us who feel that way, what could we be doing? Because I guess, I'm thinking about all of this and this conversation we're
Mhm,
having. And I know at a certain point, obviously I can't make someone change their mind, right? I can
yeah,
only control what I do.
exactly.
So instead of being so dogmatic about something that deserves to be taken seriously,
Mhm,
but if I imagine that I was racist, so if I imagine that I didn't hold to these beliefs, obviously
mhm,
I'd be really turned off by strong opinions, right?
mhm,
But obviously weak opinions on this aren't necessarily effective either. So
mhm.
I guess my question is like, what could we be doing to open up that conversation without turning people off? Because sometimes I wonder about that. I'm not saying it's not wrong.
Mhm.
I'm not saying it's wrong that like people are vocal and passionate about this, because obviously we're talking about the sanctity of human life. That is incredibly important. But at a certain point, the way that internet discourse happens, I just have to wonder, like, is it always the most effective? Are we doing it effectively? Are we doing it in a way that actually encourages people to want to listen? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that's hard because I feel like the only person who can control if someone wants to listen is that person. If you're not willing to change or listen or learn or even entertain the other side, I don't even think there's anything someone could say.
Mhm.
Because even if you try to relate it to something they've been through, they can always come up with, "But yeah, but I didn't do X, Y, and Z," or
Yeah.
something along those lines. And I think that's where it gets very difficult. And I think that's where people get frustrated because very often you'll see people not even want to listen or entertain the idea that, hey, maybe I'm wrong about this, or hey, maybe I can learn more about this, or maybe I could at least listen to their side. I feel like it gets very dogmatic and very locked in our own spaces, and it's very hard to even get someone to open up, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And I know we were kind of talking about before the podcast. I'm like, I know it's kind of controversial. Like, I would never say something that like, Nazis are good people. I'm not saying that.
Hmm.
But it's that challenge of like, if we really believe human life is sacred, at least as a Christian, then like I don't really get to choose who deserves love. Now, obviously, respect, or like I don't have to talk to everybody. I don't even have to like everybody. But there's this element of like I'm thinking personally, like, what is there anything I can do on my end to not necessarily water down what I believe or what I feel needs to be said, but be
Hmm.
done in a way that actually gives people a chance to listen to it with their defenses down,
Yeah.
because that's what I'm thinking is like with the way a lot of these conversations are happening, I'm not going to police anyone say you're doing it wrong, but I'm like, it doesn't surprise me that, it's not. I guess right now I'm thinking about one person in particular. He's a I don't remember who it is, but he's going to be in some upcoming Marvel movie. But he was talking about how like the past week and a half has really just like opened his eyes to the issues with the police. But like
Hmm.
in that instance, it's not rhetoric that changes
Yeah.
it, right? It's just the
Events.
reality of what's happening. So again, I'm not going to police, I say police, I'm not going to tell anyone
Mhm,
how to, have a conversation. But I guess just in the back of my head, I just wonder if I see someone that says, well, if you believe this, and this, you're a garbage person. Immediately,
mhm,
I don't think I would ever want to listen to what that person has to say. And maybe that, when you say that, you
mhm.
don't want anyone to listen to you anyway, right?
Yeah,
But then I kind of
'cause
wonder,
mhm.
uh,
Be
I don't know. I don't know.
because and this was a lesson I had to learn myself. Sometimes it's venting, sometimes it's not
Mhm.
meant to get anyone over to the other side, because sometimes it's just so much you have to release it. I know, at
Yeah.
least for me, I'll say when I said garbage, by the way, just to clarify, I meant more garbage views, not people.
No, I know, but
Yeah.
I say that not because you, but
Mhm.
as host of, co-host of this podcast, I try to take responsibility of like not encouraging, because there are people who are like, no, you're garbage, you're worthless. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, like that's not helpful either.
Mhm.
But I know what you're saying there, and I appreciate the clarification though.
Mhm.
So you're saying that like you just have these moments of venting, is what you're
Yeah.
saying? Yeah. Yeah, and I get that. So then I kind of wonder too, like, well, is there a responsibility of, proper social there's, again, I
Yeah.
could go down a
It
rabbit
gets
trail
into such
here.
a bigger thing, and I feel you, I genuinely do, because I've been like, even when people say like something that I've struggled with a lot, when people say all men are bad, and I can understand that if it's people who are coming from a place of trauma, because I felt that too. But on the other hand,
Mhm,
though, I have to also say, look at where the all men are bad rhetoric comes from. It's usually from a place of, in the past, not currently, of anti-black and Latinx men racism,
mhm.
or sometimes it's co-opted by turfs to exclude trans women. But on the other hand, it's venting, so it's a very difficult balance. I agree with you, and that gets into a more bigger of, should you be venting though on your public platform all the
Yeah.
time, and does every single side you have to be said in public? Like I tend to vent
Definitely not, I can tell
like I
you
tend
that.
to vent more about that kind of stuff to my friends,
Yeah,
so it's usually kept off of my platform. But I don't think as many people have that same sense of, not responsibility, but I guess that same sense of knowing how to be responsible with the platform.
yeah.
And then that gets into, like you said, like, are you controlling people now on what they can and can't say? And then it
Mhm.
gets into a whole big
Yeah. It
discussion.
to me, it's a challenge, not like a
Hmm.
challenge like you're doing anything wrong, but it's encouragement to think about, and I've told, bleh. So I remember talking to Jack about this one time where I was like, "Hey, like, if you think about Twitter, you say something and you release it out there, you have
Hmm.
no control of where it goes, right?"
Exactly.
So there's a certain point where I think you have to consider the ramifications of what you say. And I'll be honest, the past week and a half, I have typed out so many comments and deleted so many comments
Hmm.
before I've posted them, more probably in the past week and a half, 2 weeks than in my entire life.
Hmm.
Because I mean, I have never wanted to pick fights with strangers more in my life than I have now. Just the
Hmm.
stuff I see. But then I'm like, is that really going to be effective? Like this
Hmm.
person here, I'm thinking about how frustrating it is, but I'm like, if I say something, do I really believe it's going to
That
make a
they'll listen.
difference? Or
Yeah,
is it going to be self serving for me because I'm going to
to
go
feel
in there
better.
and quote unquote own them? And I'm
Yeah.
like, God, it's
And I feel
not
like
worth
me
it.
and you had discussed this in a less serious way with like movie opinions. Like we talked about like how we'll just throw it out there. Like, yeah, anyone who feels this way about this movie is like an idiot or something like that.
Hmm.
I've heard way worse than that, trust me.
Yeah.
And it's like, and we don't really consider who's reading it or who's seeing it and their background on what that movie, like you yourself discussed in the Frankenstein versus Baragon episode, like with me and King of Monsters, how that really made you think. And like in turn it made me think too, how I talked about movies and how I've shared how I've had to dial back down even on stuff I don't like, Jurassic World, and just tried to like monitor it. I'm not saying people can't have opinions and can't be critical, but also what you say, how you word it, like that kind of stuff. And I think this goes for a lot of things, not just something as at the end of the day as inconsequential as movie or TV or video game opinions. It could
Hmm.
be as serious as our political views or what we say about people in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we always think through that, and 9 times out of 10, what we say online, especially Twitter, usually
Hmm.
doesn't go anywhere, right? But then
Yeah.
obviously you see some of the stuff that goes viral, and I can guarantee a lot of it was never intended to be that way, and then all of a
Hmm.
sudden it's uncontrollable, it's a wildfire, you can't stop it.
Hmm.
So, but again, as a Christian, I have to believe that if the spearhead of the new Judeo-Christian movement was a man who was known for persecuting and killing Christians, and yet this conversion, which we have said this numerous times on the podcast, I believe. I don't know, it's almost midnight, maybe I'm wrong. But I don't believe that, conversion is just like saying a prayer and all of a sudden you're a
Yeah.
Christian, right? It's an actual allegiance and commitment to a person, the person being Jesus. Anyway, when Paul was converted, like that is such a huge shift from one to the other. So like I can't let go of that belief that like people can change, but God, it takes time. It's hard. It's not easy, right? So I just think I'm like, if I just type something out of anger, out
Yeah.
of frustration, I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for it. I kind of wonder if we would take the time to consider that, like, what would happen if we actually, and again, I'm speaking myself as a white person. I'm not speaking to anyone who's actually directly been affected in these communities or, who isn't white and feeling this frustration. But like,
Hmm.
the past week or so, I have just ripped Trump a new butthole on my Facebook page. Every post has just been like, I'm just so frustrated with it. And then even right now, I'm having this conversation. I'm like, have all of these posts been necessary?
Hmm.
Like they're right. I know they're right, but like, is it necessary? Is it really
Hmm.
like, am I building my case correctly? And I don't know. I
Yeah.
think you get what I'm saying. This
I
has been
do.
going on for a little bit. I just, it pains me, I think, that we're at this point now where we can so tangibly, where we can see people so tangibly abused and killed,
Hmm.
and we're still finding ways to justify it. We're saying, oh well, he was on drugs, or oh well, he had a rap sheet for him when he was living in Texas, or he should have complied, all of these things. And I'm like, at what point in your life do you have like, the thing that I think about in all of this, and again, another challenge is like people who espouse ideas like this, they're not well adjusted. These are
Hmm.
not people who have their lives together. These are not people who have love in their hearts, right?
Hmm.
So instead of being angry, like, again, for me, I'm trying to have pity, because this isn't someone that this this is all coming from a place of hurt, right? I mean, we see how often the abused can become an abuser because they themselves have been hurt. And that's the only way they know how to have a relationship is through that, And I just with all this, is just all I want to do is figure out ways to like help people see. I'm like, I don't even care if like, I don't even necessarily I just want people to be able to look at this stuff and not try to find a way to explain it away, and just
Hmm.
sit there and just let themselves soak and wrestle in the fact that there are people who are being killed and being, not only by the people that are saying that they're there to serve their communities, but they're being betrayed and hurt by the people closest to them, right? We're seeing people
Hmm.
this week who are discovering that their friends and family are racist and they didn't know. And I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about like Black Americans who had no idea their close friends were racist until now. I'm like, this is legitimate pain. Like, we need to be able to look at that and wrestle with that and understand the implications of what that actually means.
Mhm. I think you really nailed it, to be honest. It's like, I feel like we try to explain it away so much that we don't even think about what it is, and sometimes you have to stop talking, you have to listen, and I think that really encapsulates everything we've been saying this entire hour and a half, where you have to not talk all the times. Sometimes you have to just listen, and I think that's the biggest issue, is people just don't listen.
I know I need to get better at it for sure. I mean, that's really been this past, week and a half, 2 weeks is even if I'm just yeah, I don't know what else to do,
Mhm,
because I mean, I'm never gonna have to tell my son to not do something if he gets pulled over by the police, right? My daughter is never gonna have to worry about being profiled if she goes into a store,
mhm,
right? These are realities I will never have to face, ever, you
mhm,
know? So the only way I can ever help is to listen,
mhm,
and like, I know it's not even close to being the same, but the fact that I have to have a conversation with my 4-year-old about why this is happening. I tell them this the other night and I sit down and I'm like, okay, so we need to have a talk and we're going over all of this. And I'm like, there's a
mhm,
man named George, and I just go over everything and he's sitting there. And I was like, okay, so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to pray for his family because they're obviously very upset and hurting right now, right? I mean, he's 4, he knows what death is.
mhm,
And he's like, well, can we pray that George has life? And I'm like, I wish, and like, if that hurts me even just this amount, like, I can't imagine what people are going through on a daily basis, right?
mhm,
Hearing a story about how that sermon I was referencing, one of the people there, their mother, I think was dying heart attack or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but she was
mhm,
put in the ambulance and gone to the hospital, and the son was trying to keep up with the ambulance, right?
mhm,
And he gets pulled over and arrested. He's trying to tell him like, "Hey, my mom's dying. I'm trying to go to the hospital," and he has to be in jail while his mom dies, right?
mhm,
And I'm like, I will never understand what that's like. I will never understand what it's like to the pressure of having a son who doesn't make great choices. This is a kid that I grew up with. He was arrested for Grand Theft Auto, and it's a literal manhunt, and he gets arrested and put into jail. And
mhm,
shortly after, they say he commits suicide, right?
mhm,
Of course, they open up a case because a black man committing suicide in jail. Like, you're like, okay, what's going on? This is, Hicktown, Missouri. Something's going on. Nothing
mhm,
happens, but I will never know what it's going to be like to be his mother and wonder, could I have done something different? And maybe my son would still be alive. Like,
mhm,
there is such a pressure on black parents to raise their kids right, to not worry about this, right? So
mhm,
I'm sorry. This is the kind of stuff I've been trying to listen to the past 2 weeks. And I'm like, and if I wouldn't, like,
mhm,
I wouldn't get it. And you're right. We have to listen because if we're not going through it ourselves, if we're not listening, like, we have no way of really knowing.
mhm. And it's like, I feel like, and I think sometimes it's hard because I think sometimes even subconsciously we feel almost guilt over it. But at the same point, guilt doesn't really. I don't mean to disparage anyone for feeling guilt because I think that's natural as humans. But at the same time, though, guilt also doesn't fix anything. Only action does. And I think that's why guilt can only go so far. I'm not saying everyone can donate because not everybody has the funds to donate. But if you can donate, like I didn't talk about it on my own Twitter because I didn't want to think, "Ooh, look at me."
Hmm.
But I donated $100 to the GoFundMe for George's family because I
Hmm.
felt like I had to. That was the most I can do. I can't go to protests because of I have asthma, so that would not be good, and I
Hmm.
don't drive. And on the other hand, I'm not in a position of power to change the laws. But what I can do is contribute monetarily to a fund to at least help someone affected by this. And I think even if you don't have money, just signing petitions and listening and retweeting and being there for people, I think that's also important and impactful and being an ally. And I think that's really the crux of it. If you're so busy worrying about yourself and your own emotions, of course you won't really get the issues because it'll be like, but the stuff I've been through, and sometimes it's not always about you. And I think that's just a thing that we as humans have to get. Sometimes it's not always about us and our experiences. And I think it's a very hard thing to learn, but I think it's important because when you do step out, is when you can truly grasp other people and understand other people and to not be like a nerd. But and I hate that I'm dropping this, but this series has been so impactful in my life. I think that's what Neon Genesis Evangelion is trying to say in End of Evangelion. You can only truly be happy when you're not so focused on yourself. And that's the only way things will change.
Yeah, there's a point where in being an ally, you can make it about yourself, right? And you're not
Hmm.
actually like caring about the other people and selflessness. It's interesting, right? We have this rise of self care
Hmm.
in our society, but people still are hurting, and it's like, well, I mean, I'm not saying that you can't take care of yourself, but like maybe we need to try the other way around. Maybe we need to focus on how we can help others, and
Hmm.
maybe we can find some healing that way. But
Hmm.
um I was planning on not trying to keep this super structured, and wow, this went 500 places, and I am
I know, right?
just emotionally drained right now, and hoping that I've been able to make some semblance of sense through all of this. So yeah, I really appreciate you doing this. I was less concerned about it being clean cut and structured. I'm just kind of wanted to have an actual conversation. I listen, so I'll be honest. I don't
Hmm.
listen to a lot of podcasts because a lot of the times I feel like they're either so esoteric or it's just so sterile, right? Where
Hmm.
I'm like, I want to actually listen to something that I don't feel like has just been chopped up into pieces and put together.
Hmm.
But that being said, like I said, I really appreciate you joining tonight. Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything that obviously you've shared, where you write. But if you have anything else you'd like to plug, like any social media accounts, if
Hmm.
you have any closing thoughts, this would be your time to shine.
You could find me at Fairyzilla, which is much easier than my old username.
Oh, geez. Yeah, the Mulder 216543321. I don't even remember. It was
Yeah,
like, what?
and Fairyzilla is spelled Faerie, and then of course Zilla.
And that's on
And
Twitter, right?
yep, on Twitter.
Okay.
And that's basically the only place I'm at. And as for closing thoughts, I just want to say I really appreciate you doing this. Like, I think that this one got really heavy, but in all like the right places. Like, and I think that's the only way we'll come out of this is if we dig deep and be honest about things and our
Hmm.
feelings. And like, to once again be cheesy, like the same way End of Evangelion is impactful because it's about Shinji finally accepting who he is, and to have and the way and that the only way he can live life and be happy is by accepting that sometimes stuff will be hard. It's that same kind of thing. We can only change our society and ourselves in a way if we're open with where we come from and what we've experienced and what's around us. So I appreciate you a lot for holding this and doing this. And I know it's not my place to say it because I am just an individual. I'm not a monolith for any of my communities, but I think that's why you're a good ally. I think you generally work to understand it, even if you don't always. But I don't think you ever talk down about it. And I think you always make an effort. And I think that's what matters.
I appreciate that. I really do. Um, I will say the one of the things I really try to do in this episode is not correct myself. I really just kind of wanted to, I'm just going to say something. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, right?
Mhm,
Obviously, I think if it would have been really wrong, we would have had to stop. Um, but I do want to use just these last couple minutes to share some resources. So, obviously, as who I am now, we talked about before, you're not just
mhm,
born and immediately have all of these ideas, right? So, I understand not everyone that listens would be a Christian. So, I can only really speak to that context, but I do have a couple books that, for those who would like to get into this a little bit more, I highly recommend. So, the first one I would say should be read by everyone, not just Christians. But it's called Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. He was a very prominent voice in the civil rights movement. Was actually one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentors. But this book gets into the idea of Jesus being a um, what would be considered maybe second, third, fourth class citizen within the
mhm,
first century Palestine. Um, and it's talking about what the experiences of people who have their back against the wall, so to speak, right? Because
mhm,
I think a lot of people forget that in the Bible is, the Jewish people were very oppressed. Um, it was definitely not a fun time. So kind of bringing in that idea, and he also gets a lot into what to do with anger, hatred, all these things. But very, very, very moving book. It's been one that I have a tendency to not remember words, but themes and ideas are imprinted in my brain forever. And that was a very powerful book. The Civil War as a Theological Crisis by Mark Knoll is also a really good book. That's more of a historical book, but getting into not only obviously reasons between the North and the South, their conflict there, but actually getting into what
mhm,
was happening in the churches, the divides that they had with the Bible. I think a lot of people don't realize how important a view of the Bible was in actually making a lot of these decisions. It's a very, very well written book. Mark Knoll is a wonderful scholar. Um, I know this is going to be kind of off. It may not seem like it would make sense. So, High Price by Dr. Carl Hart. So this book I found to be incredibly important because there's obviously a very prevalent idea in the media that the black community has been plagued by drug abuse, drug addiction, all these different things. Right? We think about the war on drugs. His goal in this book is to help dismantle a lot of that and dealing with addiction and just the stereotypes and stigmas that we see. Unfortunately, again, that is something that white Americans tend to project onto the black community. Um, and I found that this book was very, very, very helpful in that regard. I also really appreciated the fact that he had to wrestle with obviously there's again a trope of having a being a black male in America and not knowing your father, right? Well,
mhm,
Dr. Hart made a lot of progress. He's doing all this stuff in his life and then realized he now was a statistic because he had a son out there, right? So he
mhm,
had to start wrestling with that. And that is just it was such a very convicting and moving book. So again, helping dismantle a lot of um, stigmas and perceptions. But lastly, and I think this is I wouldn't say the most important, but the one I would recommend the most is Dear White Christians by Jennifer Harvey. So this is a white woman who's spent a lot of time interacting and immersed within the black church community. So she's not writing from like a very removed or armchair position, but
Mhm.
um, discussing the ideas of reconciliation within communities. But her big thesis is that you can't have unity, you can't reconcile until you actually repent of what issues there are, right? So,
Mhm.
Christians especially say, hey, we just need to be able to come together, all this stuff. And I love how Lecrae puts it. They say, Cray, you so divisive, shouldn't be a black church. I say, do the math. Segregation started that first, right? So it's just this
Mhm.
idea that, Christians want to, have this
Okay.
unity, but then we forget, the only reason a black church even exists is because they weren't allowed in the white churches. So we have to be able to repent from all of that. We have to be able to actually acknowledge that and not only move away from it, but we have to make reparations.
Mhm.
White people hate that word. We have to make reparations for what we've done before we can actually have reconciliation.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to share those resources there. But honestly, the most influential things in my life have just been spending time and listening to my black friends who have been willing to take the time to do that, even when I've made mistakes and they've had to correct me. Nothing will ever replace that, right? You can read all the books you want, you can, I don't know. It's never going to replace actual authentic relationships and true intimacy in that regard. So,
Mhm.
um, so again, thank you, Faye, for joining us for this episode. Um, I mean, I guess this is where I'd normally plug the podcast, but really, I just don't feel like it. So, if you just want to know anything more about us, if you've never listened to us before, our podcast is about Godzilla movies and theology. We do kind of get into the deeper ethics, morality, race, sometimes as well in these movies. But if you're interested in that, you can just head over to our website called the website is www.thekaijuapostle.com, and everything else is on there for you to find. So, for those of you who have made it to almost this 2 hour mark, we appreciate that. And next episode should be out here in a few days. But like we said, we just felt like this was more important, and we appreciate you sticking with us.